It was a Friday night, and I was feeling restless. Most of my friends were busy or out of town, so I decided to go out alone to a local bar I'd been to a few times before. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it had a good vibe, and I figured I could meet some new people. After a couple of drinks, I was chatting with a group of strangers when a guy approached me. He introduced himself as Mark. He seemed friendly, maybe a little older than me, but not by much. He had this easygoing charm that made him approachable. We talked for a while, and he offered to buy me a drink. I hesitated, but eventually accepted. He seemed harmless enough, and I didn't want to be rude. As the night went on, Mark introduced me to his friend, Eric, who had just arrived. The two of them were funny and engaging, and I was enjoying myself. When the bar started to wind down, Mark suggested we all head to another spot nearby. I wasn't ready to call it a night, so I agreed. Mark offered to drive, saying the next bar was just a short distance away. I was hesitant at first, but he assured me he hadn't been drinking much, and Eric backed him up. Against my better judgment, I got into the car with them. The drive was longer than I expected, and I started to feel uneasy when we pulled into the parking lot of a place I didn't recognize. It wasn't a bar. It looked more like a rundown house. Mark laughed and said it was a private party and that it would be more fun than any bar. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I followed them inside. The house was dimly lit, and there were only a few people scattered around, none of whom seemed particularly friendly. Mark handed me a drink and encouraged me to relax. I took a sip, but something about the situation felt off. I decided to stick to just that one drink and keep my wits about me. After a while, I started to feel strange, dizzy, and disoriented. My vision blurred and my legs felt weak. I realized something was very wrong. I tried to stand up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Mark and Eric were suddenly at my side, me to a couch. I tried to protest, but my words came out slurred and incoherent. The last thing I remembered was Mark saying, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." When I woke up, I was in a small windowless room. The walls were bare, and the only furniture was a mattress on the floor. My head was pounding, and my mouth was dry. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaky. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. My phone and purse were nowhere to be found. I stumbled to the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. I banged on the door, yelling for help, but no one responded. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps outside. The door creaked open, and Mark stood there, holding a tray with a bottle of water and some food. He smiled and said, "You're awake. Good. You had a rough night." I demanded to know where I was and what was going on, but he just shrugged and said, "You needed a safe place to crash. Don't worry, you'll be fine." His calm demeanor only made me more terrified. I asked for my phone, but he ignored the question and left the room, locking the door behind him. I knew I had to get out of there. I searched the room for anything I could use as a weapon or a tool to escape, but there was nothing. Hours passed, and I could hear muffled voices and laughter from somewhere in the house. I didn't know if Eric was there, or if there were others involved. Eventually, I heard the lock click again. This time, I hid behind the door. When Mark stepped inside, I shoved him as hard as I could, catching him off guard. He stumbled, and I bolted past him, running down a narrow hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but I was desperate to find an exit. I found myself in a living room cluttered with furniture and trash. Eric was sitting on a couch, and he jumped up when he saw me. I grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table and swung it at him, hitting him in the shoulder. He yelled in pain, and I used the moment to dart toward the front door. It was locked, but the key was still in the lock. My hands were shaking as I turned it, but I managed to get the door open and ran out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a few blocks away. The clerk called the police for me, and I finally felt a small sense of relief. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They took me to the hospital, where tests confirmed that I'd been drugged. Mark and Eric were arrested later that night. It turned out the house belonged to Mark, and the police found evidence that suggested they had done this before. I was lucky to escape when I did. To this day, I can't go out alone without feeling a deep sense of unease. I'll never forget how close I came to something far worse. During the summer, I love spending my time outdoors, especially when I visit my grandparents' cabin in the remote woods of Vermont. The cabin is surrounded by dense forest, with a small creek running nearby and endless trails to explore. It's the perfect place to disconnect and enjoy nature. One warm evening, just before sunset, I decided to take a walk along one of the trails that led deeper into the woods. The air was humid and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. I grabbed a flashlight just in case it got dark before I returned and set off down the trail. The woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, and I felt completely at ease. As I walked further, the trail became narrower and the trees seemed to grow closer together. The sunlight was fading quickly and the forest was getting darker. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. The sounds of the forest seemed to quiet down, and I noticed how still everything had become. It was strange, but I brushed it off as the natural transition from day to night. After walking for about 20 minutes, I came across a small clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, weathered wooden structure. It looked like a hunting blind, or maybe a tree house that had long since been abandoned. Curious, I approached it, shining my flashlight on the rotting wood. The structure was covered in moss, and the door hung slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to peek inside. The interior was empty, except for a few broken boards and some scattered leaves. It smelled damp and earthy, and the air inside felt colder than outside. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound behind me, like a soft whisper. I froze, my heart pounding. I shone my flashlight around the clearing, but there was nothing there. The whispering stopped, and I told myself it was just the wind. I started back down the trail, walking a little faster now. The forest felt different, darker, heavier, and unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Then I heard it again, a whisper, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped and turned around, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated nothing but branches and shadows. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and shaky in the stillness. There was no response, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned back and started walking faster, almost jogging now. The whispering grew louder, and it wasn't just one voice anymore. It sounded like several, overlapping and incomprehensible. Panic set in and I broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing in my hand as I tried to stay on the trail. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved in the trees to my left. I turned the flashlight toward it, and for a split second, I saw a figure. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its gaze on me. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering was all around me now, louder and more frantic. I could hear branches snapping behind me, as if something was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get back to the cabin as quickly as possible. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, but finally I saw the faint glow of the cabin's porch light through the trees. I burst out of the woods, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My grandparents were sitting in the living room, startled by my sudden entrance. I didn't tell them what had happened. I wasn't even sure how to explain it. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, its long limbs and shadowed face. The next morning, I went back to the trail with my grandfather, determined to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. But when we reached the clearing, the old wooden structure was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. My grandfather said I must have been mistaken, but I knew what I had seen. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, and I haven't been back to those woods since. Every summer, my parents take a trip to visit my grandparents in Maine, leaving me home alone for a couple of weeks. We live in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of a forest, with a long gravel driveway and no close neighbors. It's peaceful, but at night, it can feel a little too isolated. I don't mind being alone, though. I usually spend my time watching movies, playing video games, and hanging out with my dog Max. One night, about a week into my parents' trip, I was sitting in the living room watching a movie. Max was lying on the floor next to me, half asleep. The only light in the room came from the TV, and the rest of the house was dark. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard a faint knock at the front door. It was so soft that at first I thought I imagined it. Max perked up, his ears twitching, and let out a low growl. That's when I knew I hadn't imagined it. I paused the movie and sat there for a moment, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I got up, feeling a little uneasy, and walked to the door. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole, but no one was there. The driveway was empty, and everything was still. I figured it was probably just some kids messing around, so I shrugged it off and went back to the couch. About 10 minutes later, I heard the knock again, but this time it was coming from the back door. My heart started racing. No one should be back there. The backyard is fenced in, and the only way to get to the back door is through the gate or by climbing over the fence. Max was on his feet now, growling louder. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, walking cautiously toward the back door. I didn't turn on the light this time, hoping to catch whoever it was off guard. When I got to the door, I peeked through the small window, but again, no one was there. I opened the door just a crack and shone my flashlight outside. The backyard was empty, but the gate was wide open. I knew I had locked it earlier that day. My stomach dropped. Someone had been back there. I locked the door and double-checked all the other locks in the house. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just some pranksters. But Max wouldn't stop growling, and he kept pacing back and forth between the living room and the front door. I decided to call my friend Jake, who lived a few streets over, and asked him to come over. He said he'd be there in 10 minutes. While I waited, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, holding a kitchen knife just in case. Max was still restless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Then, I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the living room window. My blood ran cold. The curtains were drawn, so I couldn't see outside. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I stood up, gripping the knife tightly, and slowly approached the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the yard, just beyond the porch light, was a man. He was tall and wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up so I couldn't see his face. He was just standing there, staring at the house. I froze, unsure of what to do. Then he took a step closer, and I panicked. I dropped the curtain and ran to the kitchen, locking myself and Max inside. I called Jake again, my hands shaking, and told him what was happening. He said he was pulling into my driveway and would be at the door in seconds. I stayed on the phone with him until I heard his voice calling out from the front porch. I ran to the door and let him in, explaining everything as quickly as I could. Jake grabbed a flashlight and insisted on checking the yard. I didn't want him to go out there, but he was already heading out the door. I stayed inside, watching from the window as he walked around the house, shining the light into the trees and bushes. After a few minutes, he came back and said he didn't see anyone, but the gate was open again. We called the police, and they arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the property and the surrounding area, but didn't find anyone. They told me to keep the doors locked and call them if anything else happened. Jake stayed over that night, and I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the living room window. They were large, and they led from the backyard to the side of the house, then disappeared into the woods. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. But for the rest of the time my parents were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching.